welcome to the opening panel on soft authoritarianism in geopolitical complexities, which is part of our autumn school. And it's my pleasure and privilege to chair the panel and to welcome all our three speakers. I'll introduce them to you in a moment. The idea of the panel was to reflect on the impact that Russia's war against Ukraine is having on the conditions of what we have called soft authoritarian governance. What we have in mind are both the effects of Russia's military adventure, neo-imperial designs, but also the geopolitical tensions and alliances that it has created. Now, of course, we've chosen our panelists from three key geographical regions: Turkey, India, and Eastern Europe, Hungary, because not only are the implications of the changing geopolitical complexities different in each region, but I think the perceptions of those realities and the perception of even, in fact, Russia's aggression is very different depending on where you are looking at it. So let me introduce our three distinguished panelists, and thank you very much for participating in this evening's discussion. Let me start in the order in which they will present. Evren Balta is a professor and department chair of international relations at Özyeğin University in Istanbul. And her work has focused on political violence, on questions of security, citizenship, transnational politics, but also on Turkish foreign policy. She has authored several books. Let me just mention a few. The latest, a couple of years ago, The American Passport in Turkey, National Citizenship in the Age of Transnationalism. The one the year before that, The Age of Uneasiness. And a couple of years before that, the book's Global Security Complex. She's been editor of Neighbors with Suspicion, Dynamics of Turkish-Russian Relations. And I think that's going to be one of the things she will focus on. Professor Ranabir Samaddar is a political scientist and a critical theorist at the Calcutta Research Group, of which he was the founding director. He's a pioneer of peace studies programs in South Asia. He has worked on questions of justice and rights in the context of many conflicts in the region. More recently, his research has focused on migration and refugee studies, nationalism, postcolonial statehood in South Asia, and also new regimes of technological restructuring and labor control. Most recently, under COVID, he's probably been among the most prolific of writers, having written one and edited two books while under lockdowns in Calcutta. His books include a three-volume study of Indian nationalism. Its title is Whose Asia Is It Anyway? Then followed by The Materiality of Politics, a two-volume study. Then mid-2000s, The Emergence of the Political Subject, followed by Neoliberal Strategies of Governing India. Then a very interesting volume called Karl Marx in the Postcolonial Age, and most recently, Postcolonial Age of Migration. Ranabir is associated with, he's an affiliated scholar on our research group on soft authoritarianism at the University of Bremen, where he is at the moment. Renata Uitz is my colleague in Vienna, Budapest. She's at the Central European University. She's a professor of comparative constitutional law at the CEU. The university is now located in Vienna, so that is where she teaches, but she is co-director of our university's Democracy Institute, which is located in Budapest. And that location itself, or our dual location, has something to do with soft authoritarianism, the university having been forced to relocate out of Hungary. Her work focuses on the transition to and from constitutional democracy. She has written on the protection of individual autonomy and religious liberty, as well as the rise of illiberal constitutionalism. She has published several books. Let me mention the 2005 volume called Constitutional Courts and History, Freedom of Religion in European Constitutional and Conventional Case Law, 2007, and then most recently, together with Andras Shayo, her colleague at the CEU, The Constitution of Freedom, an Introduction to Constitutionalism. And with him together, she has co-edited a volume which I really want to recommend, the Rutledge Handbook of Illiberalism, which is really extremely pertinent to our discussion. And it came out this year, 2022. So we'll follow a first round of initial statements from each of our panelists between 8 and 10 minutes with a round of discussion with the audience. In between, if you like, I'll give you the opportunity to ask questions of one another on your presentations. Let me very quickly introduce the topic by saying a few things by way of an input. The term soft authoritarianism, as our research group has described it, is meant to flag especially this contradiction between authoritarian regimes, which, however, have a soft underbelly, soft not in the sense that they are not harsh on their populations, but soft in the sense that there are no tanks out in the street, but the major means by which authoritarian rule is put into practice is using electoral majorities in order to use the law, use constitutional courts, use parliament in order to undermine and also hollow out democratic institutions and democratic practices. So we're going to look at these trajectories in India, Hungary, and Turkey, which do evince a common set of features, although the trajectories are different, their causes may be different, but nevertheless, this corrosive form of electoral democracy ruled by strongmen leaders have successfully managed to use the legitimacy of large parliamentary majorities, which have been attained through a mix of plebiscitarian manipulation and also skewed political competition in many cases. So this kind of penchant for anti-constitutional illiberalism, polarizing populism, seemed almost impossible to challenge, at least domestically, until quite recently. Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine seems to have served as a much-needed wake-up call for the international community, which is also redefined in this context the limits of the possible, that is, the rules of the geopolitical game. So one of the key questions is how leaders in Hungary, or how the governments in Hungary, India, and Turkey have then reoriented their respective positions in this changed geopolitical context. India has been, of course, a traditional ally of Russia for several reasons since Soviet times, and these ties have clearly not been severed. The regime has been facing increasing pressure to redefine its association with the Russian regime, but it's, of course, dependent on it not only for military purposes, but there are also deep-rooted sympathies in India on the anti-imperialist ideologies of the Cold War and its aftermath. So this is a complicated relationship to Russia, not necessarily to Mr. Putin. Erdogan has long entertained a friendly personal relationship with Putin, but the war in Ukraine, I think, has provided him an unexpected opportunity to reassert a bid for regional hegemony and use domestic ethno-nationalist sentiments as a successful tactic of distraction from dwindling popularity and especially from economic crises in Turkey and a plummeting currency, and in order to also gain favor with the West. So I think an interesting comparison and contrast here. And Orban in Hungary has been a vexed one, probably because on the Russian aggression, the question of Russian aggression, it's the Polish-Hungarian bloc which has fractured because of the total difference in perspective and in alliances along within the EU on the Russian aggression against Ukraine, with Putin, with Orban positioning himself very much against the sanctions, and with a very large popular support in Poland, both by people and by the government, for taking in the refugees from Ukraine. So let's look at these three case studies and look at how the geopolitical dynamics have changed domestic politics, look at how the war has affected the geopolitical positionings of these three countries, and finally, what insights can we gain about the characteristics of soft authoritarian rule in terms of political strategies, in terms of techniques of governance, if we compare them all in a way to Russia's full-fledged, not soft authoritarianism. With that, I turn to the panel. Let me start with you have the word.
Couldn't hear the last verse, but I think it's me, right?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a great opportunity to discuss three really challenging case studies. But let me start with a personal note. At the end of the 1990s, I think it was 1998, a Yugoslavian academic friend of mine who survived a decade of war and state collapse told me that we need a new definition of power based on uncertainty. The war, he said back then, has changed his life by making uncertainty a systematic and stable component of his life. I wasn't quite sure 20 years ago what he was exactly referring to as a social scientist. I knew what uncertainty was, what risk was, but I didn't know what it meant to live in a constant, systemic, and stable uncertainty. Since then, I think systemic and stable uncertainty has become the defining feature of era, not just a systemic feature of our lives, but also about a systemic feature of the regimes that we are currently living in. In a widely cited argument, Jaworski once wrote that the main feature of democracy is their institutionalization of uncertainty through elections. Yet through rule of law and strong institutions, democracies offered stability to counter the uncertainty of elections. The emerging hybrid regimes of Turkey, Hungary, however you call them, populist authoritarian regimes, competitive authoritarianism, or soft democracies as you call, absorbed the institutionalized uncertainty of democracies, but destroyed the stable component, rule of law and institutions. And the outcome was, as I said, systemic uncertainty. Even the repression, both spatially and territorially, was uncertain. For example, a work by Deniz Erkmen and Mert Aslanap on Turkey shows that emergency-like suspensions of rights in Turkey occurred in Turkey in a highly localized and temporary forms in the absence of an officially declared and stable state of emergency. And even the declaration of emergency was truly uncertain. So the citizens of our regimes like Turkey and Hungary, faced a paradox. Their only remaining stable figure was a leader, and yet these leaders were the mere forces behind this uncertainty, reflecting and intensifying the systemic features of our era. The very core of this leaders' power was their capacity, in fact, to manage the systemic uncertainty. This uncertainty, as we will be talking, was not just domestic, but there is a geopolitical aspect of it. These leaders not only benefited from increasing systemic geopolitical uncertainties of our time, but they also became the prime actors who induced geopolitical uncertainties. How they did this? For example, they increased their capacity to manage geopolitical uncertainty by relying on authoritarian tactics at home, which made their rule more resilient to sudden geopolitical shifts, as we have been witnessing in this region since more than a decade or so. And they also increased their bargaining power by instrumentalizing certain geopolitical risks. For example, the concentration of refugees in Turkey and the concentration of fossil fuels of Russia increased both countries' bargaining power, because they could be used to create more geopolitical uncertainty, this time for Europe. So we are talking about a more complex, as you said, as your title is suggesting, a geopolitical complexity that's occurring under a systemic and absolute uncertainty. The Russian and Turkish foreign policy elites defended their cooperation dynamics in the face of this geopolitical complexities and uncertainties as the model for 21st century. Turkey is, for example, as we all know, formally a member of Transatlantic Alliance, yet it has developed a close security cooperation with Russia in many geographies, even though their models, perspectives, interests on regional and global matters widely differed. Turkey dubbed its new foreign policy as flexible alliances, which could be understood as a significant reduction of Turkey's dependence on stable alliances or formal alliances to handle regional security crises by becoming more flexible in their foreign policy affairs. This happened, of course, as I said, in the context of an increased uncertainty about the norms, leadership, and commitments of the transatlantic alliance. Due to the reasons that have been widely discussed, transatlantic alliance had faced significant challenges in the last decades. The commitment of the US to the European security has substantially decreased. The normative power of the EU has almost disappeared. And even the countries within the transatlantic alliance began to emphasize flexibility and autonomy in their foreign affairs. And the alliance was not even sure of how to engage with authoritarian governments, how to handle disruptive powers like Russia. It was under these conditions, I think, the idea of After Europe has emerged. And After Europe, in fact, was a reference both to ongoing trends and also to an uncertain future, what's going to happen after Europe, or post-Western ideals or post-Western world. And we know from the literature that on regime change, basically, exogenous or international forces are salient elements in the process of political change in favor of democratization. Many studies in the 1990s, 2000s, for example, discussed how EU political conditionality has a strong and robust effect on democratization. Other actors, such as the US, also played influential role in encouraging democratization through imposing political conditionalities for trade deals, investments, economic and military assistance. So the benefits of democratization under political conditionalities included international legitimacy, international lending, access to credit and investments, integration to the security umbrellas, weapons sale, and so on and so forth. This all changed, as I said, through the weakening of the transatlantic alliance or with the idea of Europe, but also through the emergence of a new actor like Russia, who would provide such benefits to countries like Turkey without any political conditionalities. Let me very briefly discuss about what are the benefits that Russia has been offering to countries like Turkey and how this changed the democratic process of countries like Turkey. First one is already mentioned by Dr. Randeria about this idea of the West. And that goes to the concept of disinformation and misinformation sphere, actually. And Russia is the first major power that really embraced the new information revolution and how it could be employed as a political instrument. So the Russian propaganda ecosystem continuously emphasized the shift to a post-Western world and the problems of the US hegemony. The main message of the propaganda ecosystem was this: a unipolar world led by the USA was turning the planet into a dictatorship of one country, and that Russia should stand against it and take the risk of challenging the global US hegemony. In this narrative, which has been going on around for more than a decade, Russia presents itself as a global messiah. This view has overlapped with the negative public sentiments towards the US in the global South. It also has overlapped how the Turkish government, for example, decoded the world under its populist discourse. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has reinforced this anti-Western narrative in the Russian information ecosystem. RT and Sputnik, which are critical elements in this ecosystem, are still active in Turkey, still active in the global south, and are still feeding this anti-Western discourse. So the Russian power has been very influential in reframing the geopolitical complexities, and many countries like Turkey found themselves in that narrative. I mean, they really overlapped with this narrative. But it was not just reframing. There were also material benefits, as I said, from this cooperation. Let me list some of them and stop there. For example, Russians provided a huge market with a lot of investment opportunities to the Turkish business. Two sectors mainly benefited from this access: construction and textiles. Russia has become the second largest investment site for Turkish construction companies. And if you follow Turkey, you may know that Turkey's developmental model has been based on the construction sector. So it really is profitable for the construction sector, this cooperation with Russia. And the war right now is providing further opportunities to both sectors, both to the construction sector and to the textile sector, since the West is withdrawing from the Russian markets. Turkey, as you know, are not joining to the Western sanctions against Russia. And right now, for example, Turkish Airlines is the chief operating airline of the Russian population. Istanbul airport has become a hub. Russian tourists are pouring in Turkey. Turkish firms has found a huge market accessible to them. Turkish textile and industries are replacing Zara and H&M right now in Moscow. So it really is a huge market for the Turkish business. The second one is energy provision and energy geopolitics, as we know, which is very important for Europe. And Turkey has always wanted to be an energy hub for Europe. And right now, Russia is offering Turkey to become the hub for Europe, since after the Germany's cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 project, Russia is and Putin publicly announced that Turkey could become the hub for the energy, for not just for Europe, but for the region. And also, Erdogan asked for a price discounts for imports of Russian energy, requested to pay them in Turkish lira, and this and that. And Turkey is really getting may get favorable deals because of this connection, which is, again, very important for the re-election of Erdogan. So that is another component. Furthermore, Russians provided weapons transfer to Turkey, as we all know from the famous case of S-400s, without any political conditionalities. That may not continue in the short run, but it still is in the memory, right, of this of political conditionalities and weapons transfer. And right now, Turkey is bargaining, using its connection with Russia as a bargaining chip to get weapons deals from the US. And even in the NATO deal, for example, with the admission of Sweden and Finland to the NATO, this is a part of the bargaining, right? Other things that I can do, I can add, ability to negotiate with the Russians when no other actor wants to negotiate also provided Turkey international prestige, and the role has substantially increased after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And you know probably many things that Turkey has done, brokering a deal to allow grain shipments to resume from Ukraine's Black Sea ports, prisoner swaps, mediation of, hosting talks between Ukraine and Russia. So I can go on. There are lots of advantages that countries like Turkey could really get from what is going on, from the geopolitical complexity, and they're basically using this power as a bargaining chip to increase their status, material benefits, and this and that. But this is, let me stop here by saying this. The future is quite uncertain again, and it is basically related to how for example, the Western Alliance, Transatlantic Alliance, is going to respond, whether they are going to be cohesive in their response to Russia, whether there will be secondary sanctions for countries like Turkey, whether countries like Turkey have certain autonomies to deal with Russia in economy, in energy deals, and this and that. As I said, we are again facing a systemic uncertainty, and that is gonna really shape, I mean, these responses are gonna shape our future, not only in terms of foreign affairs and foreign policy, but it is gonna shape the democratic potential or the democratic path of these countries, whether these countries are gonna take the democratic path or not. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Evren. Let me turn immediately to Ranabir.
Thank you for having me over, and I was listening intently to the previous speaker, and I thank her for the points that she made. In fact, a large amount of, or the large section of the ideas that she pointed out or put forward for consideration, they cover quite an amount of what I wanted to say. So I shall not repeat them, but I shall take this opportunity to put a question to which I do not have a clear answer, and frankly, I'm still uncertain about how to address the general problematic set for today's discussion. The question, namely, is that in the context of geopolitical complexities, what are we witnessing today? Is it authoritarianism, or in this case, soft authoritarianism, or nationalism? Now, the questions, if you excuse me, you will see that they are rather paradoxically set. An apparently global frame and local perspectives and possible local explanations on this occasion relating to India, Hungary, and Turkey. Now, as I said, that the Turkish case in many ways is similar to Indian's case. The scale is, of course, different. On the economic side, issues are, different. The arms question is there, but there are many other things. But at the same time, these posers assume that the current European conflict around Ukraine has important consequences or implications for these three countries, in particular their political systems. The implications or consequences, whatever they are, will be to an unequal degree and of nature. And I doubt that they can be generalized under a discussion on authoritarianism. Very briefly, let us say, if you think of foreign policy, India was never a part of any transnational and transcontinental military alliance. Hungary was once a member of such an alliance and is now a member of a continental union that is fast becoming a military alliance. Turkey was once a part of a regional and military alliance led by the West and is now a part of another military alliance led by the same great power that led the earlier one. So the peculiarities of this situation are many, and we have to be careful while studying them and not immediately undertake any hasty generalization. Take the case of India. Now, India was one of the three pillars of non-aligned movement. And while the country has moved in recent years towards several compacts, such as the one regarding the Pacific situation, yet the question relevant for the global South remains relevant for the Indian nation also. It is namely, what does a European war mean for the non-Europeans? Should not there be respect for a nation's right to remain neutral, not to take side in a war? It is, if you recall the post-World War II decades, the historic right of the smaller nations, smaller peoples, to remain non-aligned. And this is what the decolonized countries of the world in the 50s to 70s had proclaimed in the context of the Cold War, when the Americans and the West in general put a demand on the rest of the world that it must choose a camp. Concrete situations, therefore, will require equally concrete analysis. In the neoliberal war, Global South may think that there is often no just war within quote. And to craft peace politics in such a contingent situation, the first requirement nations may feel is to refuse to take sides and resist the pressure to take a side. Hence, if you look at it from the angle of peace among the nations, then nations have to declare, first of all, against any politics of transnational military alliances, be they be of the East or the West. Recall Julius Nyerere's words, very famous words, spoken in the 60s, when the elephants fight, the grasshoppers die. And when the elephants make love, the grasshoppers die. Connected to this is a new geopolitical question, which I think I have already anticipated. Is anything Western necessarily global? A conflict in the West is not necessarily a global conflict. Indeed, there are greater possibilities of reconciliation and resolution of such conflict if kept local. Today, there is therefore, irrespective of our personal inclinations, a new meaning to be non-aligned and to claiming neutrality. Sanctions have weaponized life conditions of common people. Think of Afghanistan in the last decade of the last century. Think of the 2 decades of Iraq. And these conditions are well known to India. The life conditions of the millions of the world and economic conditions of poor countries importing oil have been weaponized. Refugee protection policies too have been weaponized. Russia is rightly accused of waging a war. Similarly, the Western sanctions are held responsible for targeting civilians. So in this situation of ever-expanding sanctions, where war becomes hybrid war, you can see the natural tendency of nations of the South to remain neutral. Precisely because what do you account for when you find that hundreds and thousands of children in Iraq died due to sanctions? So the history of responsibility is discriminatory. In short, I am cautioning against a hasty generalization. Authoritarianism within a country, the 3 countries mentioned in today's call for discussion, or several other countries may or may not necessarily have an organic connection with the value-laden projection of the current Ukraine conflict as one between democracy and authoritarianism, or as the current EU foreign policy chief described recently, as between the European garden and the savage or jungle outside. The relation between the global and the local is contingent. The significance of the relation should be discussed at length, and as I said, therefore, this discussion is very relevant, and I'm grateful to the previous speaker for introducing some of the points that I wanted to say. Authoritarian regimes will act in self-interest, but we have to note this may at times sit well with the nation's interest. But again, this will be purely a contingent situation. Lest listeners should misunderstand me, I must clarify that this does not mean that we can ignore the global geopolitical perspective of the current Ukrainian conflict. Its relation to authoritarianism is immensely significant. I shall conclude with only 3 aspects of the relations very, very briefly. First, in the wake of a neoliberal globalization, borders are being redrawn. Democracies, as we know, and non-democracies, again, 2 received terms, are equally virulent about borders. Europe's borders are being redrawn in as much as borders often in Asia or in other continents are being redrawn. Immigration has much to do with this, as have been, of consequence, the restoration of 1989. And this still drawn out consequences of the two world wars. Take, for instance, the famous address by Etienne Balibar at the borders of Europe given in the early 90s. Today, after 30 years, if you read it, you will see it looks like a tract from a different planet, perhaps illusory, perhaps real at that time. I must confess that I myself was enthused by this vision. I still reread it. But the realist in me has troubled me all along. This whole idea of a European citizenship or transnational citizenship. I am certain that the time of that address, that is post-restoration Europe vibrating with new left ideas, has left us. The philosopher gave that lecture in the backdrop of the almost decade-long Yugoslav wars, which we should not forget, and the peculiar position of Greece. Thessaloniki, with its Kemalist lineage, was the venue of that inspiring lecture. Yet can we forget that already the Balkan Wars had started, which were a direct fallout of 1989, which caused deaths in the thousands, while by and large, Europeans had the assumption that 1989 was an event only. Border wars were supposedly features of the non-European world, and that 1989 would not reshape the borders of Europe for decades to come. War, this dangerous word, was almost strangely absent from the philosophical musings on border. Yet, as we know, borders make power authoritarian. Reinforcement of borders calls for greater force, force of authority. Power reinforced by war rules out reconciliation. Second, and I'm coming to the conclusion, the geopolitical transformations are products of a neoliberal globalization and its economic, trade, logistical, and political and military ramifications. The heightened tension between the two Koreas, rearming of Taiwan, the toxic attraction to the tool of sanction as a part of hybrid war, these and many others are features of a new global scenario of a warlike global condition. Sanctions create new borders and require authoritarian exercise of power. We are caught in our memory of world wars, and this restricts our understanding of the new global wars, which is to say local wars with global implications. The challenge, therefore, for me at least, as a peace practitioner, as an activist of peace, is to argue that conflicts must be kept local, and one has to strive for reconciliation, which is possible only when the conflict is kept local. Warlike condition breeds authoritarianism, as always, everywhere. Democracy and authoritarianism in this context are converging in daily practices and exercises of extraordinary power. This is a point made quite some years back by two South Asian historians, Aisha Jalal and Sugato Bose, describing the political history of South Asia. I shall request the listeners to seriously study the convergence thesis. Finally, this warlike global condition is an extreme biopolitical condition. In such time, most governments will consider protecting their own populations from the ravages of conflict as the first task. This is the voice of the nation. The Ukraine war came on the back of the global crisis of COVID-19. Most governments were already thinking of protection as the first duty and the prime ground of their legitimacy. Recall Louis Althusser's point of conjunction in his reading of Machiavelli. There is no immanent causality in a transformative event. The empty space of the prince suggests the most pressing question in philosophy: with what should one begin? Machiavelli's answer, if you recall, was that all beginnings emerge from the void. Void is the space of the beginning of political practice. Perhaps, as one commentator has said, the only possible starting position is that unknown represented in the figure of the prince. The peace which does not yet exist is made possible only by thinking within this space. For Machiavelli, it was the meeting point of virtue and fortune. Similarly, ours is a time of contingency. Ideology has ended in this void. Ideology cannot make sense of the void. Crafting peace in the neoliberal time begins from the void. All of this suggests a relook at the question, if you will, the point zero, as I said, authoritarianism or nationalism. How do we figure out the problematic and renew our journey towards a dialogic future, a kind of a permanent dialogue between authority and society, power and peace, bordered existence of a nation, and a relational life, which is to say federal life, and finally, between an unjust past and our daily practices towards a just and accommodative existence. If transitional justice was found relevant for Global South, I see no reason as to why it will not be relevant for Europe. As I have said on numerous occasions in recent times, 1989 is not over. Only politics of peace and reconciliation can cope with the effects of transition and can become the real answer to authoritarian rule. Is this not what we may call a necessary utopia? Thank you.
Thank you, Ranabir. Let me turn to Renata, and then we'll pick up some of the points for discussion.
Thank you very much, Shalini, and thank you very much for the invitation and including me. I will speak from a comparative constitutional perspective, so try to stay close to my trade. And of course, if you speak from this perspective, then the answer to your initial question of has the war changed anything in Europe, and are we closer to tackling soft authoritarian practices, then you will say that, look, the European Parliament just passed this resolution in the middle of September that called Hungary a hybrid regime of electoral autocracy. And they've done that specifically, and I'll quote the language of the resolution, because Hungary blocked the restrictive measures against Russia in a manner that constitutes a security problem for the European Union, end of quote, that is for the European Union as a whole. So this resolution at first blush suggests that the war actually was also a wake-up call for European institutions to look at the type of soft authoritarian, or what I call illiberal practices, much more closely, look at the context and take the impact of these measures seriously as they impact the European Union as a whole. Now, of course, the problem is that it has taken quite a while to get there, and that this resolution was passed by the Parliament, arguably the least powerful of the European Union's institutions that could have said anything about Hungary's actions. And this resolution is actually urging the others to do something about the type of undermining democracy that Prime Minister Orbán is engaging in. Now, I said that from a constitutional perspective, I talk about illiberal democracy as a way of how soft authoritarian tendencies manifest on the ground. Shalini started with saying that it's soft because there are no tanks on the street, because you have political actors using electoral majorities and using the law to serve their purposes. These purposes are, and this is a pattern that we observe from India to Brazil to Turkey, of gradual arrogation of executive powers through legal means, very often through constitutional amendment, through impairing constitutional accountability structures. This is where attacks on the courts or court packing come into the picture. And of course, self-perpetuation through elections. And last not but least, which will be important for my argument, through redefining human rights and constitutional liberties in majoritarian terms. Now, as an analytical instrument to study what happens in these countries on the ground in a manner which is very much informed by context, I'd suggest that instead of looking at the various legal sediments of their actions, we need to actually study contextually situated patterns of action and inaction on the ground and also on the international level, because ultimately it's not only the various actions and measures particular actors took, but also the delays, the trepidations, and the paths not taken that speak to how soft authoritarianism operates and how it settles in. And frankly, it settles in slowly through national actions and also cross-national and cross-regional interactions across interrelated contexts. We do see plenty of international movements across borders, at political conferences, and also on occasions of simple pre-election visits, where like-minded leaders meet like-minded leaders, and also where like-minded leaders meet their potential political allies who they expect to see winning the next election. So these alliances work not only across presidents and prime ministers, but also presidents and prime ministers extend invitations to rising political stars in their political friendship groups. What we do see a decade and several well-won elections later is that illiberal practices normalize illiberal democracy or soft authoritarianism into an everyday experience. And I use the term normalization here, not simply in the ordinary sense of the word, that, you know, civic space is shrinking. We can all sense the chilling effect of this or that rule. But, you know, so long as there are no tanks on the streets, the coffee is still good. But also in the sense as work by Diane Vaughan, who studies the Challenger space shuttle's disaster, referred to normalization as the normalization of deviance. In her work, what she showed was that the Challenger disaster happened while NASA commanders observed all the rules and professional standards that they thought applied to preparing for the mission. So the disaster itself was not the result of misconduct, but rather what happened over years, over several tests that showed the particular fault not to produce a fatal result, was that the bounds of acceptable risk shifted. And it resulted in an institutional culture where deviance became gradually normalized and more technical anomalies became acceptable as the years went by. I would like to suggest that what we have seen in the past decade through the slow reaction, especially in the European Union, to the particular illiberal practices that Poland or Hungary have been exhibiting is exactly this normalization of deviance that undermined the very basic vocabulary of how we talk about constitutional democracy and how we talk about human rights. The result is that we have a major change in what is imaginable, not simply what is acceptable behavior from political actors. You know, the occasional threat of some sort of a lethal attack on a journalist just randomly at a public forum, or a similar tweet lashing out at your opponents and their supporters, but also what is imaginable as a future. Because if you can't imagine a different future, then frankly, you can't mobilize for it, neither in a legal sense, nor in terms of social mobilization. Social mobilization is something that happens when you sense oppression, it's resistance to oppression. But, you know, shrinking space while the coffee is still good is simply just a somewhat unpleasant, but certainly not oppressive personal experience. Of course, I'm trying to be provocative here, so pardon the sarcasm. Now, from the perspective of my profession, what we do see as normalization of deviance is the gradual retrogression of human rights standards, which happens which happens not only in the European political space, but also globally. And it's quite interesting how, for instance, all the efforts and achievements in protecting women's access to reproductive health care in the Americas is overshadowed by the quite appalling judgment of the US Supreme Court that opens up the path to severely restricting access to abortion. We also see around the world a majoritarian turn in interpreting fundamental rights. So freedom of speech not being the privilege of the woke, but rather having to be the right that protects the elected majorities and their leaders in office. And if you think of patterns of behavior and particular political pronouncements made to this effect, that something you heard didn't come from Modi or Bolsonaro, but from prime ministers in the West, don't be terribly surprised, because illiberal practices are not the hallmark of illiberal regimes, but actually are present all around, even in self-respecting democracies. So let me come to one dimension that does matter a great deal. The previous speakers already emphasized how these particular political actors we very often focus on speak very strongly in terms of national values and national sentiments. They speak a local language, and very often they emphasize strong protections for national constitutional identities and a sovereignist exceptionalism that makes international human rights standards and other international standards of decent behavior unapplicable to them. But actually what we see in the background is that they forge new alliances, picking and choosing their friends. They are uniting around traditional values. As we speak at conferences on demography and also on protecting women's rights as the rights of the traditional family. We also see how soft powers are being used, especially in the higher education space, through carefully selected partners for bilateral agreements that foster international student engagement, student and faculty mobility across like-minded regimes. So where does this take us then? The new normal when it comes to the war in Russia and the way ahead, the war and Russian aggression in Ukraine and the way ahead. Because in this climate of normalization, Russian invasion of Ukraine seems to fit a pattern. Frankly, it has happened before. And the mocking of legal tools and mocking of referenda, as we have seen it recently, is not the first time, but rather we've seen this before. Nor have the Hungarian reaction, or for that matter, other reactions to the war shocked any. This is by now part of the menu of options in the new geopolitical reality and the new realities of foreign relations or international relations. What we see, and that's quite interesting, is how Poland is using the changed circumstances in European politics around the war to reclaim its credentials as a good European citizen without moving an inch on promoting illiberal democracy. Just keep in mind that the Polish prosecutors were among the first to collect evidence of war crimes in Ukraine. This is the same Polish prosecutor that has been heavily criticized in the European Commission's rule of law reports as not being up to scratch by European standards. And frankly, the international community it seems to be lagging behind. While we are talking about Russian atrocities in Ukraine, we shouldn't forget that atrocity crimes are far from being well-defined or prosecutable at the moment. And when conversations are pressed among high-minded international circles, then very often it turns out that, you know, this is one of many pickles. This war is one of many wars and one of many crises to which the international community has to attend. At the moment, the most promising sign of legal mobilization for democracy, promoting democratic values and human rights that we see on the ground is the exemplary solidarity of civil society actors on the ground. They are collecting evidence of war crimes with 21st century tools, but let's just not forget that this solidarity effort can go exactly as far as the compromised infrastructure of international justice will permit. So let me leave it here, and I look forward to the discussion.
So thank you very much for all three contributions. Let me just start out by making 2 points and then ask if you would like to directly address the points made by each of you. I think Evren started off by saying we are in an age of systematic uncertainty, and this systematic uncertainty is produced and used by the regimes that we are looking at. So both the creation of uncertainty is, as she pointed out, at the geopolitical level. Interestingly, some of the uncertainty by soft authoritarian regimes is also created at the domestic level. So what Renata points out is that what is the reaction trespassing of boundaries constantly in the form of illiberal practices, and she points out to the normalization of this deviance as one response, which actually then leads to greater violations, because nothing really happens seriously when these boundaries are pushed. And what she points to, however, is also in terms of methodology, I find very interesting to say, let's look therefore not only at the contextually situated patterns of action, but also of inaction, of the paths not taken. And the paths not taken, especially in transnational responses to some of these violations and some of these trespassing and redefining of human rights and minority rights in this particular context. The Evren pointed out, of course, to both the symbolic benefits accruing to realigning oneself in the Turkish case, and the flexible realliance from the NATO, partly to the NATO, partly, however, outside of the NATO. And the interesting dynamic between, on the one hand, all of these countries claiming national sovereignty, and loudly so, and at the same time, as Renata pointed out, they are also making transnational, transborder alliances. So it's a double game of stressing your sovereignty, but then on very many cases making very strong cross-border alliances, both with existing regimes and also with emerging new leaders who may win the next election. Now, Ranabir's contribution was in a way coming to this obliquely, because he's asking two fundamental questions. One question is a European conflict necessarily global? And therefore saying, let's look at what the dynamics of global and national is, and making the argument that if you are thinking in terms of peace perspective, it's very important to keep a conflict local. And that's an interesting thing to think about. My question here would be, in a sense, I don't know if it's just about the perception of something as a global conflict. So the thing is, yes, it's a European conflict. It's very much a European conflict, but it becomes global because Sri Lanka has an energy crisis as a result of it, or it becomes global because Egypt has a food grain crisis as a result of it. So it's not as if it's global because, or not global because of the perceptions of people, but its effects can be global without the conflict itself being a global conflict. And the question here then is, I think, that as you point out, it's not, yes, it's a time of contingency, one in which ideological factors probably play less of a role. But if we want to think of solutions, and this is where you point to two things which I found important. One, not only the contingency of this relationship between the global and the local, but the use of, on the one hand, warlike conditions, which are biopolitical conditions by certain kinds of regimes, and then the question is to what ends? So on the one hand, yes, to national protective ends, but also, as we see von Evren's description, they're also not necessarily protecting their populations or citizens. They are equally interested in protecting the self-interest of the regime and of the leader. So I think there is a dynamic here to the use of war to further one's own rather than, so what is defined as national interest can very much be the interest of the leader rather than of the nation. But the second dynamic that you point out to, I think, is equally important, and that is when sanctions become part of a war economy or an economics of war globally. And this is something we are seeing not only in the Russian case, we've seen this in terms of the US sanctions in Iraq. And we have seen the malnutrition and the lack of medicines available and the millions of citizens who not only suffered but died as a result of it. So there is a whole politics of the sanctions, which, as you point out, create not only a different biopolitics, but they create also new borders. And those borders are not the borders of nation state, but they also create the borders between, if you like, the rich and the poor, because as Evren pointed out, Turkish Airlines is doing very good business, but it's not any Russian from any province who can now suddenly fly to Turkey. There are privileged, those who are privileged can cross borders even under wars and even crises. And the worst hit are not just citizens, but poor citizens in most countries who are forced to remain behind because they don't have the resources to cross these borders. So this is just sharing with you some of the thoughts that went through my mind while I was listening to you. And I was reminded in a way of, the old Disraeli quip saying, His Majesty's government has no permanent friends and enemies. His Majesty's government only has permanent interests. And so I think in a way what we are seeing is the permanent interests of many of these rulers also couched in nationalist terms and in an anti-imperialist rhetoric when it suits them. And that's where I'd like to invite any comments you may have on each other's papers and then presentations, and then we can open out the discussion immediately. So you have the word. Whoever wants to comment on the other two sets of issues raised by all of you.
Shalini, can I pose a question? And this is a question to Renata, which is that, as I mentioned very briefly, that I find convergence even in the legal mapping of authoritarian and democratic countries. So it is not only in the context of the Ukraine war, but let's say something that started happening in United States from the Patriot Act and all that. So the use of extraordinary powers by democracies, the current kind of a heavily censorious regime in Europe. So do you find that war is actually fostering authoritarian modes in democracies too, and therefore Europe actually provides a perfect example of the convergence thesis? And legally, case by case, the examples that we shall cite from soft authoritarian countries could be paired with instances of practices of quote and unquote liberal democracies. How would you respond to this?
Well, I mean, thank you for this question. Of course, this is one of my hobby horses. So constitutional, like even the best scripts for which are venerated for constitutional democracy, are full of tools that are illiberal, and even that can be used through illiberal means, through illiberal political objectives. So let me give you one example which will be very familiar. I mean, emergency powers, as you do mention, are a classic example where traditional checks and balances and constitutional constraints are of course all thrown out the window, in the hope that as soon as you restore normalcy, normal government, normal operations, judicial controls, regular elections will return. And we know full well how emergency powers can be misused. We also do know that in post-independence constitutions, the type of independence, the type of emergency powers which were familiar throughout the empire were not abolished, but very often strengthened, because local independence-seeking elites saw these tools as very really useful for suppressing their own political opponents if need be. This is not, and I think it's crucial to understand that it has nothing to do with the post-colonial condition per se. This is the human condition. If you find constitutional tools to grab powers, it seems that even countries without a colonial or imperial experience will do. So that is definitely a sign of convergence. Another example is declaring anti-democratic political parties unconstitutional. It's a very noble idea, meant to defend democracy from its enemies, except that when people who seek to hold on to power through elections use this to get rid of their political opponents, right? So the list goes on, and I think it's extremely important what you were saying, that post 9/11, the counter-terror state expanded executive powers and actually normalized the secrecy of governmental repression, trying to outsource quite a bit of it through legal tools, using legal arguments. I think that what is worth mentioning here is it's not simply the war, but the perception of threats. So so threat mongering itself and using the language of extremism or threats of extremism and threats of terrorism is something we've seen on the ground that were used very systematically. I mean, Russia is the world champion, but Turkey is not that far away, in order to use legal means in the name of combating domestic extremism to really take very brutal action against disliked clusters of society. So I definitely see the convergence, and it's part of the liberal script. It's easy to misuse.
But may I just ask, Evren, you made an interesting point when you said these are not, in Turkey, it's not an officially declared emergency, and it's not even used evenly, but extremely unevenly across the national terrain, the emergency. So I think here the whole question of scale, I think, is very, very interesting, because many of these things are not happening at the nation state scale. And then the question is, methodologically also, the question is, where are we going to be looking for these things? Because it's not officially declared. So, you cannot look for it in a emergency which was officially passed by Parliament. It's being only used in small pockets of the nation state, probably in ethnic minority areas or in border regions far away from the metropolitan centers, away from the media. So I think it's also very much how the nation state territory gets fragmented through the use of some of these powers, which may also be interesting.
Sure. I mean, what you have been describing about the territorial declaration of the emergency powers has been in use in Turkey for more than 30, 40 years as a response to the Kurdish conflict as well. Because in the 1990s, there were emergency situation was declared in the southeast of Turkey, and the rest of the country, it wasn't declared. So the special aspect of the emergency was already there. What I am mentioning or underlining that is specific to this era is that sort of a mobile emergency. And what I am referring in terms of when I say mobile emergency, and I'm referring to Deniz Erkmen and Mert Arslanov's work on protest ban. And what they argue, because of the concentration of power and concentration of power at the executive level, and the executive doesn't have to really go to the legislative process and get an emergency declaration anymore. They can ban anything at any time. And it is really in terms of the special and temporal dimension, it's mobile, right? You don't even have to declare emergency right now. But when you look at the protest bans, what you actually see in that situation is sort of an emergency declaration, which either the judiciary or the president takes the decision to ban the protest and this and that. So there is a certain difference in that sense. I mean, the temporal side of the emergency declaration was already there, but this is almost unpredictable mobile emergency situation that could be very flexibly used by the executive and by the how to say, let me just stop here, by the executive. Please go on.
I'd love to have a question to actually both Evren and Ranabir. To Evren, I really admire the how you argue with uncertainty and artificially manufactured uncertainty. At the same time, because of course, the whole idea that you are suppressing a coup and you are restoring order is a language of uncertainty. So what's the function in Turkish public discourse of using the centenary of the 1920-21 constitution making momentum and Atatürk's legacy in justifying the current way of exercising presidential powers? Because and why it's very interesting for an external observer that a new continuity is being created, at least a rhetorical continuity, and so I'm wondering whether and who is the audience of that. And to Ranabir, I have a totally different question that goes to conflicts being local and keeping them local versus going global, because Russia and Turkey, as we know, have their fingers in several other very local conflicts in the neighborhood. So accepting that it's easier to settle a local conflict and you have to focus on local dimensions. I mean, don't all of these players who are around the theaters of war essentially playing a global game, and how would your account pull those threads together? Thank you.
Well, if I got the question correctly, I couldn't really get the audience part. I mean, when you asked about the audience, I didn't really quite get that part of the question. But for the first part of the question, when you were asking whether the presidentialization or the personalization of the political system is really being justified by the Turkish history and the legacy of Atatürk, right? Is that the question?
But also the Minister of Justice saying that, you know, we are not really departing from Atatürk's legacy. I mean, the fact that it was a different political regime, whatever, it was still a strong leader. And so there were a lot of speeches along these lines, at least reported in the English language literature and commentaries by think tanks around the centenary. And I found those very curious.
Well, domestically, it has never been the main or the major justification of the personalization of power. I mean, like securitization of the Kurdish question, or the Syrian conflict, or the coup in 2016, or the suicide bombs and terror attacks of ISIS, and all those things. I mean, this changes in the external environment and also in the domestic politics has been used more for the justification of the personalization of power. I mean, there might be some references, but as far as I recall, as I said, there were really not the main justification of the personalization of power. But obviously, Turkey has this culture. I mean, if you refer to the political culture of strong leaders, charismatic leadership, which really resonates with the public when you see a very strong political leader that really organizes uncertainty in the face of external threats. So the public pretty much feels, probably, and I'm really just do not have any sort of research on that, but that might resonate with the public's feelings of or closeness to this tradition of strong leader. But other than that, and the government always try to put a bit of distance, the AKP government and President Erdogan himself, with the legacy of Atatürk, right? Sometimes they justify it with using the examples of the Turkish past, but there's always this distance, because the whole government is basically the whole idea of populist discourse, the elites versus the people. Elites basically refer to the secular people who identify with the legacy of Atatürk. So that's kind of a tricky question, or the tricky problem for the government.
My brief response would be on it will be twofold, but I shall also take this opportunity to address the first point raised by Shalini. I think the question of scale operates in two ways. One is that the national power never acts as national simply. And in the making of the nation, whether you think of the colonial time and think of this famous history of by the Cambridge historians of towns, bazaars, and countrymen, how the nation was being made. So you have, along with the emergence of the nation and who speaks on behalf of the nation, the making of the local and the medium scale. And that was true when the nation was being made in the colonial time, and that's true today. But what is new in this situation is that things were much more formulated and much more clear. These operation of scales was often along clarified lines and you could make sense of them. And on the other hand, what Evren is mentioning as uncertainty, the theories of chaos are saying that actually, as in physics, you deal with the theory of chaos, that chaos is one of the conditions of life. Similarly, in the neoliberal time, you have a condition of chaos that overwhelms the global situation. This is where the scalar operation of national existence and coexistence of nations will be continuously adjudicated and continuously negotiated. So you may say that this is a return to some kind of this ancient Greece daily plebiscite, daily management of your scales of existence. So that is one. In other words, the nation is up for contest. In as much as those who are being, now told that they are authoritarians, they will say they speak on behalf of the nation. Similarly, all the points that Renata, that you mentioned, with the demographic, the return of the family. I mean, tell me when there has been a national ideology without the reinforcement of family ideology. Even in the colonial time, even in our own anti-colonial discourses, it was always reinforced that family is the unit of the new national rejuvenation. So this is not purely kind of a nectar. The poison and the nectar, they are mixed with each other. It's a mixed thing, and you cannot simply throw it away. You have to engage with it, and the struggle for democratization continues. But my second point is, for me, more important. What makes power increasingly more authoritarian? And what moves power away from a dialogic frame to an authoritarian frame? Because power can stem from dialogue also. And that is where I think the remaking of the borders, the massive immigration controls in Europe or elsewhere, we are talking of Hungary, we are talking of Poland, you talk of entire Europe, we can think of India, that anti-immigration and therefore the remaking of a nation as a safe space for a certain group, that is becoming important. And there also the scale is important, because unlike what generally is thought, that globalization is reinforcing borders. And 1989, without 1989, we cannot think of globalization. We cannot think of the new logistical era. We cannot think of new commerce, new trade, and this whole theory of pivot of Asia, which Putin is now practicing, which Hillary Clinton reintroduced from the pages of history in 2012 as the Secretary of State of Obama administration, first Obama administration, and which was originally propounded by the British, that whoever controls the heartland of Asia will control the world. And this is precisely what Putin is thinking today, that you move away from Europe. But to move away from Europe, the renegotiation of the boundaries and borders will be needed. And that will reinforce power, once again, authoritarian mode of power on both sides. This is where my point, that if you think in the terms of World War model, we are trapped in that World War model where necessarily we are thinking in terms of world conflagration. So Turkey was a member of CENTO, Thailand was a member of SEATO, Europe, many European countries became a member of NATO, even though De Gaulle went out in a huff, then France came back. So you had these global security arrangements. Except NATO, think of the world the global security arrangement of that type is over. The world doesn't think that that's the appropriate way to ensure security. It's a much more, as I said, daily negotiation of your security question by making alliances which need not be stable. In fact, to think of stable alliances is a vestige of the old wars. Today, therefore, what I was proposing as a serious theoretical question is that global wars are not world wars. They are local wars, as Shalini pointed out, with enormous global implications. And therefore, the counter strategy, if you like, will be acknowledging the global implications and yet keeping them local so that you know that you can reactivate the peacemaking capacities of societies. Because as I said, that all I am saying is from the angle of peace. That what is the peacemaking capacity of society? What is the, the scattered way in which peace constituencies exist? How do you pull their strength together? How do you audit the capacity of peace in exactly you do environmental audit? How do you audit the capacity of peace, the strength of peace? This is where the old global strategies will not work. This is where, if you think of Africa, once again, I will say, and I know that I become unpopular for saying, if you think of the global South, you will see how conflicts are negotiated. Think of Africa where Kofi Annan, in his last days, these were attempts that he made which have been largely unappreciated, where he went from country to country with his group and brought out solutions. Think of the way in which massively violent situations between Latin American countries are being negotiated. The condition for this is that somehow or other we have to keep the conflict local. This is not to say implications are not global, but strategizing and harnessing those global capacities to keep it local and to negotiate and to effect a kind of what you would call minimal justice, not maximal justice. I mean, that is important. And without that, I do not see national coexistence, reconciliation, these things can be taken forward. So both scale and the way power is rendered authoritarian, these are the two things that we need to pay close attention to. And it is from that point that I asked Renata that it is important to see how within democracies power become authoritarian, to understand how actually authoritarian powers draw from democracy, begin from democracy. In fact, India is the classic case. 3/4 of what the current government does, the basis was laid down by the previous so-called liberal governments. So this is why I said the convergence thesis must be taken seriously into account, because otherwise the chaotic condition in politics that we are seeing, we will not be able to make sense of that.
Okay. So, Renata, response to that, and then I open out for the last half an hour. Immediate response.
I promise to be very, very brief, because I think, and I found, Rabin, there's two examples of authoritarianization of power that is redefining the borders and redefining who belongs to the nation. Particularly telling, because in one reading, these are actually pre-political conditions of having a state. So you have a state when you have a border and when you have a fixed population. And when we talk about democratic politics, these are more or less by and large settled, and democratic politics should be accepting the existing constraints and playing by the rules. So I think that so that could be actually a very important sign when you are questioning where the borders are and who the people are, whether you are using rules on citizenship or refugee or protections for refugees or migration control is secondary. It is really secondary when you are asking who the people are, then you are essentially trying to reset pre-political conditions. I mean, I think we are more in agreement about the peacemaking capacity of society and the importance of self-healing and reconciliation than you propose. But where I could have taken the argument a step further on why I find it particularly alarming that the capacity of civil society to hold perpetrators of war crimes accountable, dependent on the international community, is exactly where we seem to converge. There is a recent study. I put in the chat the paper that was done, the consumable version by Jennifer McQuarrie and Murat Somer, on pernicious pernicious polarization and de-democratization. And one of their findings on a global scale is that major shocks might tilt the axis of the universe towards democratization. But what they also see is that another condition which they observe globally is that if there is an international commitment and if there are external, that is global forces that push regimes towards democratization, then there are better chances for reducing pernicious polarization. And in an environment where there is chaos on the international level, at least there is less and less of a consensus on commitment to human rights, democracy, rule of law, then the conditions for the local healing capacities, even when you have civil society mobilization to this effect, are severely undermined. But I'd love to discuss this further. I just understand we have to go to a Q&A.
Let's open out and we can come back to, let's pick up some questions. So thank you very much to all three panelists. Let's see where the discussion is headed when we ask the audience to join in. So I have two possibilities, as I was told. Those of you who are on the live stream on YouTube, you have the possibility to write your questions and they'll be transmitted into the chat function to me here. And those of you who are joining us here by Zoom have the possibility either to raise your hand and ask your question yourself, or to write it out in the chat function. If you would just, because I don't have all of you on the screen, all 29 of you, so I'm constantly trying to go back and forth to see if someone's raised their hand. So if you could just type me a message saying you'd like to ask a question, then I'll just move to you and allow you to ask your question yourself, unless you prefer to type it in, and then I'll read it out for you. But just signal that you want to ask a question. So while we wait, Ulrike, all right, you have the word.
Yes, I didn't want to go first, but I thought if we're still waiting, I will do. And I'm thank you ever so much for these inputs. I think they're really inspiring, and I do understand Ranabir's point that sort of this idea of the stable alliance in itself is sort of trapped into this world war logic. I understand that, but still I think that Evren was actually pointing out, or that's my question maybe also towards Evren, that this idea of uncertainty that you are talking about is something that is not just on the level of everyday experiences of people living in authoritarian situation, but also a way of doing politics on an international level. That's what I understand from what you. I prefer to use the word flexibility, or the term flexibility, that I have the impression that soft authoritarianism is precisely characterized by an extreme form of flexible, going this way and that, and moving, shifting, one day doing reforms, the next day doing fierce crack down on the opposition and so on and so on. And I have the impression that what you're trying to tell us is also that this becoming or having this power of bargaining is precisely doing that on the scale of international politics. So my question would be, is that what you're saying? Is that a specific authoritarian way of doing international politics, putting yourself into a position or taking all opportunities to bargain, and in this way keeping even a country like Turkey can even make the EU into a hostage kind of way of doing politics on the international level? Would you say this is something that is somehow specific to this kind of authoritarian politics? That's what I'm curious about.
Evren, directly to you.
Okay. Well, you summarized that so well. And I do agree that the flexibility aspect of the authoritarian governments, or what you call the soft authoritarian governments of our era, is one of the major instruments of power. The way that that they basically become everything at the same time, and is such a powerful instrument of bargaining and negotiating. So I definitely agree with you. But with the question about whether this is something peculiar to Turkey, or whether that could be generalizable to other cases, I think that could be, I mean, my cases are Russia and Turkey, but when I compare Russia and Turkey, I think they're basically using the similar strategies of navigating through uncertainty and creating uncertainty on the external actors as well as the domestic audience. I mean, look at the forms of repression. They're not even signaling, right? I mean, the way that we know how the repression works in the previous authoritarian era, that they signal to the population that if they act in a certain way, and then that would be criminalized or punished and this and that. Under these regimes, we don't even know who is going to be targeted, what is going to be the problem, right? As you say, because, right? I mean, mainly because of the flexibility itself, because this government, for example, negotiated Kurdish peace deal 4 years ago, and everyone was talking about peace, and you know, like integrating Kurds, rights of Kurds, and this and that. But suddenly it became criminal by this, I mean, a criminal act by the same government with that flexibility, right? So the sudden shifts really makes your behavior, or let me say differently, the sudden shifts is about, I mean, you cannot adjustment or predicting what is going to come next is very different, very, very difficult. So that flexibility and uncertainty, I think they go hand in hand, and which became a sort of governance technique. Not really, you know, like punishing all the defectors and that, but creating this unpredictability, so that you begin to censor almost everything, all your behaviors, everything in your daily lives, in your political expressions, because you don't know what's going to come next and what's going to happen the next day, but that the government is going to change the strategy, shift the discourse, and criminalize the activity that they once thought politically correct, right, or not criminal, or in fact legal. So that unpredictability, uncertainty, I guess, I mean, intentionally or unintentionally, is a major governance technique, I would say.
Thank you. I have next on my list Issy Fujishima. You have the word, Issy.
Thank you very much. I'm a student of transcultural studies in Bremen, and you talked how crisis strengthens authoritarianism, and speaking from my experience in Japan, indeed, a strong shift toward authoritarianism came on the heels of the 2011 earthquake and nuclear disaster. So my question would be, if crisis can strengthen authoritarianism, what are the mechanisms that help democracies strengthen after a crisis? Is there such a thing? Because we can also think of many democracies historically coming out of crisis or coming out of moments of turmoil. What would you say about that?
So let me leave that as an open question, Missy, to all three panelists, or would you like one of them to answer first? Let's see who wants to pick it up. What kind of crises? Maybe Renata?
May I just answer? Let me speculate a bit here. I mean, it depends on really the nature of the crisis, what type of crisis that you're talking about. So with regard to the populist governments, the type of the crisis or they manufacture crisis, and this sort of manufactured crisis really helps them to consolidate their power. Or crisis, sometimes crisis like, protests or threats to the national security, where you can have sort of a real threat and a manufactured threat coming together, and they can very well juggle with that sort of crisis. But consider the crisis of COVID, which is a more existential sort of crisis, which populist governments and authoritarian governments may sometimes have difficulties to respond, right? Because it may require a stable social security system, a system that responds well to the crisis situations. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it really depends on the nature and the type of the crisis. And for example, if you look at the performance of the COVID crisis of the Turkish government, they took it very seriously, not like other crises. They didn't really try to securitize it. They created independent scientific committees. They delegated power to them, specifically President Erdogan. We don't see a lot of personalization of power, the typical crisis behavior of the authoritarian governments. So depending on the nature of the crisis, these authoritarian governments really react differently. And one of the things that I would like to mention is about the concept of resilience here. I'm gonna speculate again here in responding to this crisis situation, but the crisis really requires a sort of societal resilience, right? And sometimes democracies could be more resilient because of the possibility of a government change through elections. That flexibility, for example, gives democracies a bit of a more societal resilience than authoritarian governments. But in the context of soft authoritarianism or competitive authoritarian regimes, you have that element as well, right? You go and ask to the society that, okay, here's our performance, and you can basically change the government. But right now, as you all very well know, under unfair conditions or under unfair electoral competition. But it's still, as I said, institutionalized that sort of flexibility, which gives much power to this sort of regimes in responding to the crisis, I would say. Without that sort of institutionalized uncertainty like elections, then these types of governments are maybe more durable, but more open to non-routine challenges, contestations like coup, which also may happen in this context as well. But I mean, let me stop here. So it depends on the nature of the crisis and how the authoritarian government really responds to that crisis.
Renata, you'd like to have a word, and then let me give it to Ranabir. I don't see any other questions for now.
I think it's actually a very helpful analytical question to approach these animals from the perspective of crisis, because as Evren was mentioned, they ride on crises and they very often rhetorically manufacture enemies and a sense of crisis in order to be able to respond with the types of measures that are larger than life and unexpected, and justify them with an emergency rhetoric. You constantly need enemies. Also, I mean, Ravinder mentioned it before that, you see anti-imperialist rhetorics all the time. The fact that the Hungarian government refers to the EU as a colonial power to a society which has never been colonized, right? Those are rhetorical patterns that are not meant for a local audience. Those are rhetorical patterns that are meant to have an appeal far, far away in a different corner of the universe. The same government runs on a rhetoric of persecution of Christians. Now, this persecution happens in Egypt or far, far away in Iran, but it's meant to create an environment of constant threat. So one of the reasons why you don't see the type of response in these countries that civil society galvanizes and acts is that populations in these countries are used to the crisis rhetoric. So it's the crisis of the day, and especially in a captured and saturated a media space where government propaganda is your only source of information, it's extremely difficult to tell the actual from the real. So what we do know is that centralization of power certainly undermines the capacity of governments to respond. But then again, if you look at how the UK government was handling COVID, self-generated internal chaos also undercut actual scientific expertise. So whether this is incompetence or lack of capacity to govern as a result of centralization of powers and executive power arrogation, will be very difficult to tell apart, even with terribly careful analysis. And the third bit, which I think is important here when you study soft authoritarianism and the way out, is that when there is an actual real crisis, not a manufactured one, it does make good sense to look at who resolves it. So I'm thinking about Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, where the humanitarian crisis was actually handled by the Sangha, not by the military regime. And that explained internal power dynamics and some of the political shifts that opened up, at least temporarily, the political space to a little bit of what then looked like loosening of tight controls. But don't forget that most of these soft authoritarian regimes are very strategically co-opting civil society exactly in order to undermine this independent and autonomous capacity of civil society organizations and religious communities to have genuine responses and to become the source of a genuine dissent and to mobilize democratic forces. So I think that these are 3 points that were worth putting on your map for further discussion.
We have last 5 minutes left of our discussion time, and I don't have any other questions at the moment. So Ranabir, let me give you the word to pick up whatever points you'd like from the crises to any of the other things discussed.
I will take them together and offer, not for 5 minutes, maybe 1 or 2 minutes, and Shalini, you have to conclude. So I will repeat, listening to the question of crisis, what I said, that we are still in our language, we are still locked in the pre-1989 and the kind of post-war, Second World War thinking style. two reasons or two, very short observations on that. One is that the repeated use of the word crisis will not help us to understand how power is exercised and the mode of power today. And it is a much more chaotic situation, and crisis, this word will lose its bite if we think it is kind of permanent. Then this is no crisis at all. So what is it that has made the world chaotic? Or we had heard of shock capitalism, if you remember the theorization a decade and a half back. The Chinese anthropologist Özyeğin speaks of shock migration, shock therapy as part of governance, so something that Evren said and very important. And in this time of chaos, to look for ordered responses and to look for ordered resolutions will be, let us say, if not fully, but to a great extent misleading, which is why the strategy to cope with it has also to be customized, and that's why I said that they have to be kept local. I mean, if you think of John Lewis Gaddis, theorization of peace from 1945, and if I'm not wrong, Gaddis wrote the book around 1985 or early 1980s, and he wrote this book, The Long Peace. And he said that if you remove your rose-tinted glasses, you will see precisely the mutual deterrence had achieved peace in Europe and in the world. Now, that age of mutual deterrence is gone. That kind of solid, on the whole, permanent formations are gone, and world is continuously in the neoliberal age is being made and remade precisely because of the needs of capital. Which brings in the question of the remaking of the borders as a continuous exercise. So that is the first point where, and this is the background in which I use the phrase warlike condition. And this is not new in history. We had earlier similar warlike condition existing for 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, and the peace strategies had to be developed according to that. The second point is that contingency is therefore, and certainly the question of conjunction becomes very important. And I take this opportunity therefore to go back to Machiavelli, precisely because when does a new mode of power arise? Clearly, all the evidences suggest that our theorization is inadequate to understand the way power is getting authoritarian, the way power and authority, they're combining with each other, and they're speaking on behalf of the nation as well as using the nation for power. But power is precisely stemming from its capacity to speak on behalf of the nation. If this power has disjunction from the national question, this will no longer remain the power that it is. So, which is why I said, is it the question of the nation in the neoliberal time? And this is where the point of conjunction is important, because in this chaotic condition, following the dissolution of 1989, following neoliberalism and new mode of capitalism, you will have unordered and undeliberated, unplanned events coexisting. And that is where the question of how do you read conjunction and how do you combine, Machiavelli spoke of fortune and your strength. So, but 600 years later, I think the question still remains that once we understand that this is a moment of conjunction, then how do we read this conjunction and how do we devise our response? And my own reading of authoritarian mode of power, democracy is becoming authoritarian, authoritarians are drawing their legitimacy from democratic tools. and the nation is up for grab. Who speaks on behalf of the nation? These are really questions of a time of conjunction.
I think that's a very good conclusion, because it's 1 minute to go. And I think what you're pointing to is you've been making very strongly the argument today, Ranabir, that we should, rather than think in terms of binaries, which we were not, that's why we were thinking of soft authoritarianism, because what we were trying to think about is the very slow, systematic whittling down and the slide into authoritarianism, but also not as an endpoint, so to speak, but as soft authoritarianism as a regime form which combines these two kinds of practices, democratic, and as you put it very pithily, I feel that authoritarian regimes drawing legitimacy from democratic tools is one of the major characteristics that would summarize what we mean by these kinds of regimes. So our idea is not to make the argument that it's a stage towards a full authoritarianism, but that these regimes, unstable as they appear, are here to stay, and to make the point with you about the use of democratic tools, to make the point with Renata that there is at the heart of every liberal constitutionalism as well, or democracies, also authoritarian tool sets, many of them remnants of colonial ones, but also newly introduced ones, which get, formed, reformed, and used, and also with Evren to make the point that one of the characteristics of these regimes is their production of manufacture of uncertainty. Ulrike calls this flexibility, but it's also, it's like a chameleon-like animal. You can't really sort of grasp it, because it changes its shape and form very quickly, because it can oscillate from using democratic tools, then authoritarian tools, then come back to a rhetoric which again obfuscates the kinds of tools being used. So, but this is something which is an permanently unstable form, if you like, and that is what gives it stability, paradoxically. So that's something which we were trying to capture. So thank you very much for all your three contributions, which I think illustrated very well so many different facets. I'm sorry that we need to sign off and end the conversation. I mean, the really sad part of these, I mean, the good thing about the virtual setting is we are able to bring in people from very many different locations together very easily. The sad part of it is I can't then say, so now let's go out and have a drink and continue the discussion. Because that is
virtual drinking together.
That's right. So each one would be drinking alone, thinking of topics together, which is really, in a way, not the right format, a dialogical format in which to continue this conversation. But I very much hope this is the beginning of a conversation, and we can bring together people physically. And as I said, Renata is in a much better position than everybody else. She is director of our Democracy Institute in Budapest. And one of the things they are putting together is a research program on comparative illiberalisms. And I think this could be the beginnings of a very interesting discussion along those lines. So I think Renata can then host all of us where we can
Great.
more social conversation together in person. So thank all of you who've been here online with us for the last 2 hours. And although you have not asked very many questions this evening, I really hope that in the course of the autumn school, you will have enough of a chance in smaller groups and also in larger ones to converse.